Today we're going to continue working on our industrial area. I'm thinking that this spot would have previously been a secondary rail yard which was scrapped once trucks started taking over much of the workload from trains. Then the land was sold and repurposed with two completely different developments. We're going to start by bringing this northern Pacific Roundhouse back to life, which you can see in this wonderful old photograph. Also note the streetcar tracks on the bridge at the bottom left, which will also be bringing back to life. In Duluth, the real-life roundhouse was demolished, and now the lot is completely empty. But I thought it would be fun for our city to have maintained the structure even after it fell out of use, and what we're going to do is take that structure and convert it into a railroad museum. I'm using this pack of roundhouse assets by E2 Clips and forming it into a big C shape. A lot of roundhouses seem to be a lot smaller than this, but I wanted to go for a bigger one so that it has more of a striking look from the aerial view. I think that you can even have it become a full donut if you want and have the tracks pass through like an open gate, but I didn't want to go quite that far. I'm going to draw out the rails right from the center of the turntable so that I know that they're all properly aligned to the center of the circle, and then go through and use the same rail to add nodes where they meet the turntable area. For some reason, it only lets me draw out a certain number of segments from the center point at a time, so I have to do it in batches, but honestly it goes pretty quickly once you get into the rhythm of it. To get the entrance that would have originally fanned out into the secondary rail yard, I'm going to add these temporary roundhouse segments just for reference so that I can make sure everything's aligned properly, and then draw out further to this reference track that is in line with the outer circumference of the roundhouse. For a bit of variation, I'm going to sub in this end piece that has a small shed or something attached, which I think makes the silhouette overall just look a little bit more intriguing. And I'm also going to add these sheds around the outside for the same reason. I don't know if this rectangular building is like for longer term storage of locomotives or something, but there was one in this approximate location in Duluth, so I'm going to add that in as well. It has a couple stretches of track that they've retained. Obviously, the track isn't still in use, but I thought it would be fun to have some of them running through the grounds of the museum. This road is going to be used to IMT off of, so that I can replace the surface texture of the floor while also covering up the ties. I don't know what surface you would have originally found in a functional roundhouse, but I figured even if it wasn't originally asphalt, it would be a more practical surface for a permanent museum like we're going for. To get these ploppable asphalt pieces to fit the circle neatly, I'm just going to lower the step value way down, and then add another rule with these larger pieces to fill in the remaining area. The road out front is a bit more difficult to manage, since this needs to carry not only visitor traffic to the parking lot that we're going to add on the far side of the building, but also industrial through traffic. At first I wanted to add these concrete ramps on each side of each track, but I quickly realized that that would look ridiculous since there are 4 of them right next to each other, so it'd basically just be a bunch of speed bumps. So I end up just having a concrete ramp on each end, and then a raised asphalt area filling in the middle. Over here is going to be the turnoff to the museum parking lot, which also happens to coincide with the end of the public road, so all this gray road on the other side is for industrial traffic only. It's a bit of a weirdly shaped area for the parking lot, but thankfully these parking lot roads make it pretty easy to make these funky parking lots, especially when you combine it with the magic of editing. Brought to you by a gremlin hunched over its keyboard for hours at a time. I got into a bit of a pickle when I went to try detailing up the surrounding surfaces. I'm using a railroad ballast texture for my gravel texture in Theme Mixer, which looks really good for the railway itself, but it doesn't blend too nicely with my usual detailing assets like decals, grass, and all that stuff, because it's just not designed to be used in that way. So my usual instinct when something doesn't look good is to dump a bunch of trees down, but I realized that first of all, it doesn't help at all in this case to make it look better. And number two, it doesn't make much sense since this land would have been kept clear when it was a functioning rail yard, and there probably wouldn't have been enough time for trees like this to have regrown. So I deleted the trees and just left this grass, and we'll come back to the issue of the surface texture later on in the episode. I thought that it would be cool to have the museum include the rectangular building as well. So after getting over a slight distraction, I'm going to add in this pathway between the two central tracks, using a similar IMT technique to the surfaces in the roundhouse, this time adding some expansion joints to make them look a bit more like concrete slabs, I guess. Then I'm going to use the area in between the central and outer tracks just to do a bit of landscaping and make it more pleasant to walk along. To make the pathway more integrated into the rectangular building, I'm going to grab the door nodes in PO and push them way back so that it looks like they're hanging open, sort of, at least. And then carry the track and pathway all the way inside. Presumably they would have some displays or something inside the building, but I thought it would also be cool to have this old steam engine out front. Back at the Roundhouse, I wanted there to be enough fencing to funnel people through the museum properly without it feeling too closed off. So there's a pathway that runs from the parking lot and curves around over to the main entrance, and that's fenced off from the central part of the Roundhouse. Then you have these little pipe fence gates blocking the tracks and the big pathway as well. I'm not sure if the tracks would ever actually still be used to move locomotives or something like that, but I figured I'd put the gates down here just in case rather than fully blocking them off. I thought it still looked a little bit too industrial, so I wanted to kind of soften the edges a bit by adding some planters and trees. So much like with the main pathway, I thought it might make it a little bit more pleasant to walk around with, at least outside of winter. In this spot that doesn't have any tracks, I added kind of a weird little display where you have a model of a modern engine, and then next to that, a statue of someone who I'm thinking was like the founder of the railroad that this roundhouse belonged to. So kind of just showing the progression from its beginnings to modern day. I don't know if it really works, but I felt like there needed to be some sort of unique display out here. Of course, the most important part of any railroad museum is the actual trains. This set of Rock Island train props by CBQ Fanatic is the main attraction, and it might actually be one of my favorite asset packs ever because it just looks so cool. I wanted to use all the cars that come with the engine, so I'm going to have to make them span the turntable since it's the only space that they'll fit. Obviously, that is going to keep the turntable from turning, so it might seem weird that I did that, but it'll become clear in a second why that makes sense. I try not to download too many of these one-off assets that I'm only going to use once in the series, because if I continue to do that, I'm going to run out of RAM by like episode 22. So I used a couple of the engine props that I already had on hand in my collection, and I couldn't help myself but download this one too because I think it looks so cool. Since these two come with tenders and we're very limited on how much space there is here, I thought I'd use a similar technique to before by pushing the doors way back with PO and having the tenders just poke out enough for them to be seen while still leaving room for the engine. Now for the turntable area, I decided to convert it into a little garden. So even though you do lose the functionality of being able to swing it around for demonstrations or whatever, or to move engines around, you get this sort of peaceful area where you can go down and see this Rock Island train from a different vantage point. Plus, it also takes that concept of kind of softening the industrial edges just a little bit further, which I like. To make the museum functional, I'm going to draw an invisible pedestrian path along the route people would walk through the museum, and then clip a combination of a couple different service blocks into the buildings, including a couple of entertainment blocks that basically function as parks, a commercial block to represent a gift shop, and a tech museum block to represent the main museum. So hopefully all of these are going to combine to draw the right amount and right type of traffic to this place.
And now for something completely different.
The secondary rail yard, which would have been aligned with the main avenue here, was recently torn up, maybe at the same time that the roundhouse was converted to a museum. Since the resulting plot of land is so big, which you can see here in Duluth, it's completely empty, I wanted to introduce a big and more modern development to contrast with the older industry that we're eventually going to add to the port. I'm going to use this massive asset, which is actually intended to be a slaughterhouse, I believe, and detail it up to look like a solar panel factory, which I think is going to be kind of an interesting addition to the port. I thought that the building did need a few adjustments before detailing any further, so I'm going to add a little extension over here and then angle this wall so that it's in line with the rail yard, which I think just makes it look kind of better fit into the environment. The asset has this interesting outbuilding at the front, which is attached to the factory with these pedestrian bridges, which I'm thinking is going to be the administrative portion of the business. It also allows for this cool little through road here connecting the two halves of the parking lot out front, which also connect on either side to a service road that runs around the entire campus. I tried to leave some space between the road and the building, as these kinds of factories seem to usually have some landscaping when space allows for that, which this one does, of course. The exception to this is the loading area. So I'm going to use the edge versions of the parking lot roads to outline this spot and then fill it in by using a clipping network and ploppable asphalt. For some reason, these networks didn't have matching colors. I think I might have messed around with one at some point and messed it up. So I'm going to adjust those really quickly to make sure everything matches up and looks like a nice cohesive surface. I didn't want the parking lot to create a big traffic jam, so I'm going to stop vehicles from turning left out of the parking lot or into the parking lot off of the road by having the median run through the node here using IMT and Traffic Manager. So it's a little more inconvenient for the local traffic accessing the factory, but in the long run, once we eventually start getting more industrial traffic here, I think it's going to make things a little bit more free-flowing, hopefully. Speaking of the avenue, I did want some businesses along it to be a little bit more public facing than the kind of heavier industries that are going to be clustered around the docks. So for the factory here, that'll mean that there's a kind of corporate looking pedestrian entrance, which is going to connect up with a streetcar stop that we're going to add at some point in the near future. Not in this video, but probably next episode. I wanted some branding as well to serve that purpose, although I didn't have anything on hand that sounded particularly solar panel-like, so I'm just going to use this generic sign and paste another copy on the building and size it up so that everybody passing by will end up with the business name bouncing around in their subconscious mind when they eventually rush to buy solar panels before the tax credits expire. I don't always do this kind of fiddly IMT stuff, but in this case, I just couldn't resist, especially because you're going to have trucks coming and going. So I wanted to have these slip lanes that are a little more gentle than the sharp right turns you get at normal intersections. So I made sure the corner offset was nice and high in Node Controller, and then added in some grass islands with IMT. I can't say that the final shape of the island is my proudest creation, but it might be in like the top 5 or so. Anyway, I did think that some branding and landscaping was needed to mirror the pedestrian entrance, so I'm going to add that in along with some signage for navigating the parking lot and some foliage as well. Because the exterior of the factory feels kind of sterile at this point, I did feel like it needed a bit of an industrial flair that's kind of more visible from the outside. To do that, I'm going to add an empty lot that they use as basically just a generic staging area. So basically any materials or machinery or other random stuff that they don't have a good spot for inside gets plopped outside over here. Back at the factory proper, I wanted to add a few details to make it feel busy without going so far that it feels crowded. So we have some trailers lined up with shipments of one sort or another, with a couple even ready to be pulled off by these truck cabs. I'm leaving a few of them empty so that we can move the warehouse building spawn points into those spots and have trucks spawn from there, once we get to the functionality portion of the build. I noticed that a lot of big factories like this seem to have tons and tons of ventilation attached, which I guess makes sense. So I'm going to build this little ventilation area with some props and then wall it off to shield our truckers from the hideous sight of industrial appendages. And since this factory is so big, I'm going to have 3 of these at various points around the campus. Also, there was some dead space over here next to the distribution bays, so I'm going to add a tiny little parking lot, which I think looks sort of funny over here, but it fits the space. Moving on to the functionality that I mentioned before, I wanted to keep it pretty simple. So we have some electricity blocks to represent the power produced by their solar panels at the factory. We also have a couple of factory blocks so that things can actually be produced here. And then, of course, there are the functional warehouse buildings as well to simulate all the materials and final products that they have sitting in stock. I thought that fencing off the entire campus would probably be a bit severe, so I'm going to only fence off the operational portion of the factory in the back and leave the parking lot and administrative area out front open. So I'm using this dark palisade fence with IMT, and then I'm going to use this vanilla gate asset, which I actually really like, and I'm going to darken it to match the color of the fence. I'm not going to add a guardhouse or anything here, and I'm just going to imagine that the gate functions automatically. But honestly, it's mostly just because I didn't think to add it at the time. One thing that's going to take a lot of my attention while working on the area along the rail yard over the next couple episodes is how to transition between the service road on one side and the industrial lots on the other side. In this case, I was thinking that there was a small grassy area, maybe with a few trees, in between the former rail yard that was demolished and the one that's still in use. And the bit of grass that was not part of the parcel of land sold to the solar panel company has become slightly overgrown since the old yard was demolished. So we basically have this overgrown line of shrubs on one side of the fence and a piece of neatly trimmed landscaping on the other side, which I think is kind of an interesting visual contrast from above. While I was focusing on the surroundings, I also wanted to connect up these 2 voltages of power lines at a transformer since they happen to pass through this area anyway. I don't know if these are the right voltages of power lines to have at this sort of transformer, but since I'm pretty ignorant on this subject, I think that big going into small are good enough for our purposes here. Seeing all of these trees I had in the area also made me question if it was the right way to detail this area, given the narrative that I had come up with about the old rail yard being fairly recently torn down, so I ended up removing a lot of the trees and grass that I had placed down. But getting rid of the grass and trees made the transition between the gravel ballast texture that I'm using and the various dirt textures and decals that I've been using much more apparent, and I don't think it looks good. So what I ended up doing was changing my map theme's gravel texture to be more similar to the other textures that I'm using, which I think makes the transitions look a lot nicer. The big sacrifice here, of course, is that now the tracks don't have any ballast underneath them, which I think is probably dangerous when it comes to like trains not derailing. But I think it's going to save me a lot of headaches when I'm detailing in the future, and also brightens up the color scheme a bit, which is maybe not something you hear every day about the color brown, but here we are. I did want to have something for the solar panels on the roof to actually power, so I'm going to add some very basic lighting around the campus and the parking lot, making use of wall lights and some overhead lights where they fit, which I think adds some nice visual depth to the building at night. I'm also going to return to the Roundhouse Museum and light that up both on the interior portion of the Roundhouse and the exterior as well, so you can get this nice view as you're driving into the industrial area, because as we know, everybody drives into an industrial area for the views. But anyway, maybe you could have night tours here, which I think would be pretty cool. But that's it for the Roundhouse and the solar panel factory. I hope that you enjoyed, and I can't wait to see you on the next one.